All right. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. We're thrilled to see so many of you in person. We feed off of your energy and enthusiasm, even on a wet Friday morning here in New Haven. We also have another pretty large contingent joining us in hybrid Zoom format, folks who are not in the Yale community. I'll say more about that in just a moment. I'm Ted Wittenstein with International Security Studies and the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. We're just delighted to start this year's Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, Bridging the Divide, National Security Implications of Artificial Intelligence. I'll say a bit more about the forum. I'll introduce my colleague, Professor Ona Hathaway, along with Professor Joan Feigenbaum and Professor Nisheeth Vishnoi in just a moment. A few quick housekeeping announcements. I just want to acknowledge and thank Emily Roback from Yale Conferences Events and making all this possible. Please go to her with any questions on logistics of the sessions. These are interactive. For those of you who are here, raise your hand, push the button, make a green lit to talk, and we'll call on you. For those of you who are on Zoom, I have access to the Zoom feed here of our Q&A. You can submit the written Q&A by sort of pushing that Q&A button on the right side of your screen. You have your volume and video muted, but I'm going to incorporate those questions as we go. And of course, we'll distribute and post a video afterwards for the benefit of everyone. This is the first of 3 half-day Fridays taking place this semester, featuring more than a dozen faculty members across multiple schools, departments, and programs here at Yale, joined by a number of other special guests. We're focused on bridging the divide among law, technology, policy, business, and academic communities and our approaches to thinking about cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, in particular, 3 core areas where AI already poses a number of significant cybersecurity challenges. So the first area, which is our 2 sessions today, is looking at big data, data privacy, and AI governance. The second area is disinformation and the future of democracy. Those sessions will take place on Friday morning, March 4th, 2 weeks from now. And the third focus area is AI ethics and safety, taking place on Friday, April 1st. But we intend this to be an integrated conversation examining common themes across all 3 of the sessions throughout the semester. So please do tune in. This is a great collaboration, the forum, between the Jackson Institute and the Yale Law School's Center for Global Legal Challenges. Students both at the Law School and the Jackson Institute attend the forum for credit. They're writing reaction papers based on these sessions. I encourage everyone to check out more information about the forum, the bios of our students. You can view that at cyber.forum.yale.edu. And we're very thankful to our knowledge partners, SAP, which has been able to make this forum so accessible to everyone in virtual format, and especially grateful to the Jackson Institute's new Schmidt program on artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. It's a new interdisciplinary teaching and research initiative to examine how AI has the potential to change the nature of world affairs. My colleague, Professor Ona Hathaway, has been our program director since this forum's inception. She's the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law, Director of the Center for Global Legal Challenges at Yale Law School, and a faculty member of the Jackson Institute. She's a widely recognized authority on transnational law, and she's really been at the forefront of thinking of how international legal principles and norms translate to cyberspace. She's a scholar. She's also a practitioner. She serves on the advisory committee on international law for the State Department's legal advisor, and earlier on in the Obama administration, she took leave to serve as special counsel to the general counsel at the U.S. Department of Defense, working on a full range of national security and global challenges. So let me briefly turn to our panelists before we get into the morning on AI and big data, risks and opportunities. If I read all of their bios, we wouldn't have a time to actually hear from them this morning, but Joan Feigenbaum is Yale's Grace Mary Hopper Professor of Computer Science. She's been a part of this forum since its inception as well, and her research interests include internet algorithms, computational complexity, security and privacy, and digital copyright, just to name a few. She's a cryptographer whose pioneering work has really helped define the fields of data privacy and trust management. She's devised several highly influential algorithms herself in working with colleagues, and she teaches interdisciplinary Yale courses that connect computer sciences to the social science and law, focused on technology, power, encryption, surveillance, and political challenges in the digital age. And joining us virtually on screen is Nisheeth Vishnoi. He's Yale's A. Bartlett Giamatti Professor of Computer Science. Professor Vishnoi's research spans several areas of theoretical computer science, optimization, and machine learning. He's also interested in understanding and addressing some of the key challenges that arise from computational questions, the emergence of intelligence, the interface of artificial intelligence with ethics and society. And he's the co-founder of Yale's Computation and Society Initiative, where scientists from different disciplines across Yale work together to address emerging questions that arise in our new algorithm and data-driven world. So thank you so much, Ona, for being with us, helping us put this great group together. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Nisheeth, for tuning in. So as a reminder, this session is going to run until around 10:15, 10:20. We'll have a break. The next session will begin around 10:30. So please do raise your hand, chime in as you go, submit your questions on Zoom. And thank you very much. And over to you, Ona.
Thank you so much, Ted, and thank you for doing so much to make this possible. It's no exaggeration to say that really this is Ted's brainchild, and he is responsible more than anyone else for making it possible. So thank you so much for all you've done. And it's so great to be back in the room with all of you. We've done this over the years. The first several years that we held the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, we were able to be entirely in person. Of course, that was not possible during the pandemic. We went online, that had its charms, but I have to say it really is wonderful to be back in person with students in the room so that we can actually have a real conversation. And we're thrilled to have those of you who are joining us online here as well. One upside of this hybrid format is that we're able to have a conversation with so many more people than otherwise would have been possible if we were just trying to get everyone into this physical space. So we're excited to have this extended conversation with all of you. And this year we're turning to focus on AI, which has been occasionally a topic that we've discussed in the Cyber Leadership Forum, but hasn't been our central focus. And so we're excited to get a chance to really kind of do a deep dive over the course of these 3 sessions into AI, big data, machine learning, and the many challenges that that these issues present. And we have students here who have various kinds of expertise to process and help us think through these issues. And part of what's so exciting about the forum in general and this set of conversations specifically is that you all are on the forefront of being able to work in these areas. This is an area that's shifting and changing so fast that this is an area where you all are going to be leaders, and we're excited to get a chance to be part of the introduction to these issues with you, and having a chance to begin to engage and think about the challenges, the possibilities, and what we can do to try and shape AI as we move forward. And so I'm going to start with a series of questions. The way we're going to run this is rather than have kind of formal opening presentations, we thought we were a little bit more interesting to kind of have a bit of a back and forth. So I'm going to start with some questions for Nisheeth and then a few questions for Joan. And they're going to throw it open to all of you to ask your questions. So get ready, be ready to jump in with your questions because we're going to count on you to carry the second half of the conversation. So Nisheeth, let me start with you. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad to have you here. Since this is our opening session talking about AI and machine learning, I was hoping you could start us off by just helping us understand the current state of artificial intelligence and machine learning today. We've already seen that there are examples of AI and machine learning that can outperform human beings, so famously in complex games and facial and voice recognition. How are we going to see, where does that technology stand? How do we imagine that this is going to change and interact with big data, and including the volume, variety, and velocity of information? What is this data play in short?
Okay, thank you, Una, and thank you, Ted, and Una for inviting. I mean, this sounds very exciting. So let me just state jump to your question about the state of AI and machine learning. In short, it's made tremendous progress in the last decade, and I guess that's why we are sitting here and talking about it. You have seen many great successes from winning against the best Go players, chess players, to figuring out one of the most complex biological problems, such as protein folding, to making strides in more and more human-driven aspects which we experience every day. I guess many of you here already know that much of the information that we consume online through online platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Google, these are all being driven by machine learning algorithms, which are learning from data that we generate. So in short, AI and machine learning is everywhere. Whether you are directly using technology or not, it is still affecting you in the sense that you may not be using some of these things that I just mentioned, but your colleagues or your friends or your family might be using them. It's influencing their lives, it's influencing their behavior, and they're influencing your behavior. So there is no way out of this, whether you are directly engaged with technology or not. Now to the question of where it stands. There has been a lot of very interesting examples where it has outperformed human intelligence. The central goal of artificial intelligence is to mimic human intelligence, whatever that means. I guess one way to think about intelligence is, intelligence is about problem solving, let's say, and out of all the possible strategies that you might have to solve a particular problem, you pick one which is better than the other in terms of certain resources, maybe like memory or computation time and so on. And with the help of data, which has been collected very massively over the last 2 decades, these machine learning algorithms have tried to fit in some basic models and learned a lot about human behavior and other problems, in other domains as well, and have done well in many tasks. However, I should warn first and foremost that this technology currently is very brittle. Even in the simple cases of facial recognition or voice recognition, let's take the example of facial recognition. I guess there are very simple examples where I can show you an image, let's say, of a stop sign, and you see it as a stop sign, and in the first instance, the machines, the algorithm sees it as a stop sign, but with a very small perturbation to it, which a human eye will not be able to detect, and hence still recognizes the stop sign. I can make the algorithms think that this is not a stop sign, but maybe the speed limit has gone from 40 miles per hour to 80 miles per hour. So in that sense, and this is not an example which is just specific to this setting, it's such examples are called adversarial examples, and they have shown that the current machine learning technology is very brittle to such attacks. Since this is a forum about which tries to understand how robust these things are and the potential pitfalls, I think this is one of the foremost things that artificial intelligence currently has no clue how to deal with. Whereas human intelligence, is much more robust. It has evolved over 4 billion years of life on this planet, and so there is a certain, gravity associated to it, which we haven't seen yet in this machine learning world. Then there are issues such as, I think we're going to talk more about it, so I don't want to say much more about it right now, but issues such as bias and privacy, which are very human-centric issues. And since the design process of machine learning algorithms or AI algorithms is entirely human-driven, it is not a big surprise that we are seeing many of the things or failings as humans and society creeping into this world. And I guess at a later point I can talk more about how this happens. But yeah, I think we are at a cusp where it is up to us where we want to go. And without good governance, without strong policy in place to control, this can clearly spiral out, because much of the development is driven entirely by capitalistic forces whose goal is to alter human behavior to the extent possible and to make them just use their products and buy their products. I mean, this is what is driving this, right? So I'll stop at that.
Yeah, no, you've touched on a bunch of issues I want to follow up on. So that was a great kind of introductory kind of overview, kind of where we stand. I wanted to follow one thread of what you raised, which is this question around vulnerability of personal information and privacy interests that AI makes possible, the various ways in which our privacy is put more at risk with the rise of both big data and AI. There's a story in the Washington Post just very recently that the company Clearview AI is moving towards having 100 billion images in its index of faces, which really raises the question as to whether like anyone can maintain their privacy in a world where there are 100 billion images around us. After the riots in Capitol Hill, a lot of the rioters were caught due to facial recognition technology, some of it from Clearview AI. And there's some ways in which that's great for law enforcement, but raises real questions about our privacy interests and whether AI is enabling this kind of analysis of these images in a way that makes it impossible for us to maintain any kind of privacy. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the implications of the rise of AI for our privacy interests. And again, you kind of hinted at this a bit because it's not just a question of whether you are participating in these technologies. If your friends are participating, that can put you at risk. And in fact, there were some incidents that really show this, because some of the images of some of the rioters were cases where they were images that have been put on, I think it was Facebook, by friends, not by them. And that was the way in which they were identified. So they didn't even, themselves put these images online, but these images then were used to trace them nonetheless. Now, in this instance, in my view is it's great that they were identified, but we have to take the bad with the good. And what are the implications more generally for privacy?
So privacy is one problem which the whole tech world is struggling with. It's one of the biggest problems. In Europe, they have this GDPR in place, because of which many of these big tech companies had to run and figure out how to include the restrictions that GDPR imposes on them. And things like the right to forget, for example, which I'm not even sure how it is possible. Once you have learned something about, once an algorithm learns something about an individual, it's not clear to me how it can be forgotten. I'm talking from a very deep mathematical technical point of view here, of course. So that's one aspect. But it's good that there are at an institution, even at a continent-wide level, people are thinking about privacy, and I think this is very important. So one of the examples that you mentioned is January 6th thing, which is of course very obvious. Let me say something which is maybe not so obvious, but it also suffers from this same principle. So currently, the state of privacy is the following, that people have been struggling to understand how to even define what privacy would mean. So suppose you are a part of a data set on which, from which I'm trying to learn something. So let's say I am a big tech company and I have access to your data and I'm trying to learn something from this data about the behavior of individuals or whatever, or their preferences. Now, let's say I choose you to be a part of this data set. Now, the way the privacy is thought currently in the technical world is that whether one particular individual's presence or absence in this data set changes the outcome significantly. And if it doesn't, that's considered currently as an okay notion of privacy. But these notions are very, very primitive, I must say. And they do not protect people from a variety of things. So for example, in one of the huge application areas of privacy is biomedical data, which deals with your genome, for instance, right? So now you may have participated in a study with full consent, waiving of all rights, and you might get paid for this study, right? And even if your information for whatever reason leaks out, right? I mean, so let's say your genome was used in some study, and even if your information leaks out, you've already waived off that right. But what about your family? I mean, we know through, I mean, biology has its roots in genetics, and you will share a large fraction of genome with your family members. So I mean, because your information leaks out, your family is also compromised, right? So this is a more a more subtle way in which privacy has to be understood and controlled. So where are the boundaries then? I mean, do you even own your genome? I mean, that's the fundamental question here. Can you even say that here is, my genome is my information and I have full access to it? So I don't know if you see where I'm going, but I mean, the sense of privacy is not clear to me whether it's even to an individual to decide, right? You took a picture of somebody in a public space and you posted it on your Facebook. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know if this is violating any, legal thing. This seems perfectly legitimate to me to take a picture. But now if in that picture, somebody who can be recognized as a perpetrator also shows up, then should that information be used or not? I think these are very big open questions, which I don't think we have reasonable solutions. We have only begun to scratch the surface. And my sense is that this is not a technical problem, because guidance also has to come from, what is possible to implement. I mean, I can create a very interesting, beautiful mathematical theory of privacy, but if it cannot be implemented, if people are going to reject it, it's not very useful. So there has to be this hand-in-hand thing in all of these topics that we are going to discuss in this session, where we have to take into account the human, the societal aspects, and co-develop these notions, co-develop these technologies. And this is kind of the essence of this Computation and Society initiative that we thought would be useful to have in a place like Yale.
That's great. I mean, this really illustrates in many ways kind of what we're trying to achieve with the forum, which is exactly these kinds of conversations, because you have a sense of what's kind of technologically possible and where the kind of dangers might lie technologically, but have questions about what the law might be. Lawyers might have a sense of what the law could or should be, but don't have a really good sense of where the tech is and where the kind of open issues are and the possibilities, kind of what's on the immediate horizon in terms of possibilities for tech. And so, this is kind of the idea of bridging the divide between law, policy, and tech is exactly this, is that we need to have these conversations among students and faculty who are kind of coming from these different backgrounds, because that's the only way in which we're going to be able to identify these issues and make some progress on them. So this is exactly, for the students in the room, like keeping your eye open for these kinds of questions is exactly what we're hoping you all will be doing. Like when presenters are raising these issues of like, I don't know about what this law is, like those are probably great opportunities for student papers and for progress to be made, because this was part of when Joan and I began teaching on cyber law, tech, and policy with exactly the same set of questions: is what's possible technologically and what kinds of legal questions do the technologists need us to answer, and what kinds of legal questions, what kinds of technological questions do the lawyers have about what's feasible, what's possible, how will AI potentially invade privacy, but also what are the possibilities for addressing and protecting privacy? And that's one thing we'll get to in the conversation with Joan. I want to follow up on a couple more matters, and I'm going to turn to Joan, but one in particular, and you hinted at this in your opening remarks around algorithmic bias. I want to invite you to say a little bit about what is algorithmic bias, and can you give us some examples of it? Can you help us understand this and how it can be controlled or addressed? And is there, we know that algorithmic bias exists. What are the possibilities for addressing it, and at a minimum understanding what those biases might be?
Okay, this is an excellent topic, and one of the topics where I have spent a fair amount of time thinking about. So let me start by saying that I guess to this audience, I don't want to say the obvious that, over the last few years, many studies have shown that algorithms can be biased. And the term algorithmic bias was coined informally or even formally now. One of the things that it showed definitively, and I think this is why it got the attention of everybody, is that humans are biased. So this is, to me, the first and foremost contribution of this area, is to give a definitive proof that humans are biased. Because in the end, it's not coming from a different planet, these algorithms. We are designing them. We are doing whatever it needs to be done with them. And the term algorithmic bias is a bit unfortunate, but also very, very funny in some sense, because it's actually human bias, which is encoded in algorithms. So this othering that, that's algorithmic bias is an interesting thing to think about. Mm-hmm. So now, what is algorithmic bias? So it's the following. So when you have a machine learning or algorithmic system which is trying to make decisions based on its inputs, there are multiple things that you have to choose as a designer, right? So one is, what is the data or what is the input that you're feeding this, that you have with you right now? And let's say you want to learn something from this data, or you want to take a decision based on data. So you have to fix a kind of a hypothesis space in which you're operating, because learning as such is not a well-defined notion. I mean, if you tell me that, learn how to play tennis, right? Then I need to know what are the things I have in, whether I have a brain, whether I have a body, and so on. So when we design algorithms, we have to also fix a model, which is a framework in which we learn. And the task of training an algorithm is learning the parameters of this model, which is why we need the data. We need the data so that we can learn the parameters of the model. So one of the misconceptions about algorithmic bias is that it can only arise through data, but it also arises through the choice of the model. So to give a very simple example, I think which many people here might actually relate to, many sports have fixed dimensions. So for example, basketball has a particular height of, for the net. A tennis court has a dimension. It has some rules associated to it that, if you have ever played tennis, you know that you start serving from one side of the court and not the other side of the court. There are two sides, left side and right side. And this leads to certain advantages for certain players. So I play tennis, I'm a left-hander, and I know that the game currently has some slight advantage to someone like me. And similarly, people who play basketball know that, if you're tall, then I'm short. So it's really not a sport I can play. And these parameters were chosen by some humans at the end of the day, right? Who are trying to say, okay, what's the right size of the code? What's the right size of? So a similar process is going on in machine learning, where these architects are choosing the concept classes, the hypothesis classes in which we are enabling learning. And if we don't take into account who these choices are affecting, who is it benefiting? Who is it harming, right? So, maybe it's benefiting one particular group. I guess the initial design of all these algorithms was not with the intention of hurting anybody, right? But giving advantage to one group is equivalent to hurting another group, right? So for example, in issues such as policing or bank loans, or deciding who to give parole or not, or who to give bail or not, right? The data that was being used in learning probably had some biases. The mechanism which was trying to learn was not aware that the data could have biases, so there was no mitigation strategies into this. And one of the things that we are doing now is to be more aware of the choices that go into the design of such algorithms. And I think this is something really important for students specifically in this audience to have at least a high-level view of. So the design process is like designing a house. It's like an architect designing a house. Now you might say, hey, I need some windows, so you give some specification. But as a user, you don't say that I want the window exactly at this position in my room, right? I mean, I wouldn't imagine that you would be so precise. But in the end, that decision also has to be taken. A house is a very precise mathematical object. an algorithm is a very precise mathematical object. So we will have to pin down each and every aspect of it very precisely. So without taking into account all the possible negative impacts it can have, we see that it does have negative impact. So we have to be more aware. So this is what is now called participatory design, where every party who can get affected needs to be involved in the design process of the algorithm. And one of the things that these algorithms, I mean, why are we thinking about it, right? So, I mean, humans are already biased and they have been continuing in their ways forever. The thing that makes it more urgent is the scale and the speed at which algorithms can affect human beings. So, I mean, human biases have brought us where we are, but algorithms can take these biases and exacerbate them significantly, and create a very fast motion towards a very negative, disconnected society, which I think we already observe. I mean, just the fact that if you go on Twitter, you see these two worlds, right? This is an example of algorithmic bias. So in terms of mitigation strategies, what we've been looking at, what are the potential places where bias can come in and how to mitigate them. I'll just say a very simple example, which I hope everybody understands here. It is, it's a very simple algorithmic problem where you have, let's say, a set of candidates, and you want to select, let's say you have 100 candidates, and you want to select 10 of them for an interview. And this is a problem I guess a lot of people here face when whether you're doing faculty interviews or whether you're doing, interviewing graduate students. So one of the things that you do when you choose these 10 people is to associate some notion of quality to that individual. So you have a framework in which you're reading the CV, the letters, the documents, and you come up with some ordering, right? Or some score associated to it. And these scores can be biased because they are at the end being, they're reflecting your knowledge about the world. And so maybe for one particular group of people, maybe somebody is from Yale Law School and you say it's fine, but maybe somebody is from some law school somewhere which is not so well known, right? And you might want to have, you say, I need more information, this information, that information. So what happens in this process very naturally is that the way we are evaluating, the way the algorithm is evaluating candidates, it'll not be a level playing field. And so what kind of mitigation strategies we can think about? So one of the works that we have done recently is to mathematically analyze these so-called Rooney Rule type strategies. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Rooney Rule is something that is prevalent in NFL, the National Football League, where it requires you to interview at least one Black person for the position of a head coach. This is a policy thing, So what we analyze is what is the utilitarian impact of it. So as a person, you are trying to choose the best set of candidates for yourself. Now, because of your biases, which you may or may not be aware of, you may not be selecting the best candidates for yourself. So these kinds of mitigation strategies we show are very effective. And I mean, this is a very simple example where where these things can be shown to be work, but we are also working on many other domains such as classification, which is one of the central problems in machine learning. Ranking is a problem which we all consume every day. When you go on Twitter, for all the people you follow, there are thousands of tweets that are there. Now, Twitter's key algorithm ranks these tweets and presents to you in a particular order. And we know that the order in which we consume information affects our brain. So looking at all these problems from an algorithmic point of view, what potential interventions we can suggest, I think is something really interesting. And again, requires an interaction with policy and law, because what kind of interventions are legal, what kind of interventions are not legal, this is not up to mathematicians and people like me who can just decide that, right? So I think I'll just stop here because I think my answer is very long on this one. Sorry about that.
That was great. I mean, it just shows how complex and how multifaceted the problem is. And I think you gave us a really great introduction to that. And I know you've been working on this for some time, and it's really important work. I'm going to turn to Joan because I want to make sure that we save some time for all of you to ask your questions, even though I have many more questions I want to ask Nisheeth, but I'll refrain so that we save some time for our conversation with the students at the end. So Joan, I wanted to turn to you and say, return to the issue of privacy. So you're a cryptographer who's worked for a long time on privacy, anonymity, and accountability in computing. I wanted to ask you both what concerns you most about the development of the rise of artificial intelligence, and what, if anything, can we do about it? What can we do to protect against the sort of rising concerns, particularly regarding privacy implications of the rise of AI?
Okay, thank you. So I probably should start by saying that I am a bit of an AI skeptic in that, which is not, and please bear in mind, skepticism is not rejection. Okay, I'm not saying that any kind of some technology that is labeled as AI is something I would avoid because I'm an AI skeptic, not at all. Often I hear discussions about the effect of AI on society, the effect of AI on even just the technological world. And it sounds to me like what's being discussed isn't really, the thing that is affecting us is not really AI, it's just automation, it's just technology, it's just computers. And in particular, there's a lot in machine learning, which I view as part of AI, which to me doesn't sound like intelligence any more than any other computational process is intelligence. It just sounds like sophisticated use of statistics and algorithms. And very importantly, the availability of much, much more data than was available previously, even fairly recently. So as far as I'm concerned, privacy and the kind of things that cryptographers think about, like, privacy, accountability, anonymity, I've worked on all those things. I think they are, all of these notions, as Nisheeth said, are hard to pin down and to define in a way that's both technically tractable and sort of meaningful in society. And they're all threatened, they're all sort of challenged in our current environment. Although, as Ona said, some of these threats, some of these, this lack of privacy, or lack of ability to hide, given that there's all this data available, can have some good effects as well. Can help legitimately catch criminals, for example, which I would say we want to do. So I think that what's challenging us, what's making things both possible that weren't possible before and also difficult to deal with on a larger scale than they were before, is powerful computation, high bandwidth communication, availability of tons of data. I don't really know to what extent I would call that intelligence. I would just call that technological progress. Okay, so I wouldn't say that as a cryptography researcher concerned with privacy, accountability, and anonymity and related topics, that I feel as though AI per se is really changing everything. Now, it could, in that there are some things that I could see are more properly conceived of as intelligence, and in particular as artificial intelligence. Things like deep fakes, for example. Okay, I think that this is probably properly characterized as AI and very poorly understood. So in case somebody's not familiar with the term deep fake, basically constructing an image or a video or an audio, constructing it, not just recording it in the real world, constructing it in such a way that human consumers of what you've constructed can't tell that you generated it out of whole cloth, rather than that it was recorded. So there was a famous deep fake of an Obama speech that made the rounds, I think approximately 5 years ago. And, it turns out that this was completely fabricated. Obama had never given such a speech, okay? He had given many speeches, he had said many words, so there were a lot of images and video and sound recordings of him. And someone managed to put them together and edit them in such a way that it really looked like Obama was giving this speech, like this was a recording of an actual live speech, which it was not at all. Okay, so this is something I think, is different from simply there's a lot of data and there's a lot of computational power and there's a lot of bandwidth. This is, Nisheeth used the word adversarial. This is something that is constructed with the intent to deceive. This is an adversarial action that may properly be characterized as intelligent, and it's new. Okay, so how does it relate to privacy and authentication and anonymity and accountability and whatever? So I think that I should also point out, like lack of privacy and tremendous availability of sort of data about people's location and movements on social media and everything, deep fakes are not only dangerous, they might also be beneficial. Okay, you could potentially create a museum exhibit of what life was like in colonial Williamsburg. That's not just a bunch of dioramas and pictures and documents. It's actually a virtual reality or apparently live version. And you could do that with deep fakes of the people who actually live there then. So there are potentially beneficial uses. So I guess I think that there's two things going on. There's availability of data because of the nature of our technological environment. And there are both beneficial and harmful things that can be done with them, most of which I don't think I'd characterize as AI, but the ones I would characterize as AI, I think they have the same property. Analyze data, collect data and analyze data in ways that can be helpful, they can be harmful. They can, benefit a business that's trying to target ads that's actually a legitimate business that is targeting ads to people who actually might want to buy these products and is actually, able to succeed as a business because it can do that rather than, buying broadcast television ads that it can't afford. But it could also lead to a lot of improper invasion into people's, private lives by, collecting a lot more data about people, behavioral data about people and targeting them inappropriately. AI, to the extent that it gets access, AI artifacts that get access to data that can be used improperly or properly, same thing. We have to decide what uses of data are we going to allow. GDPR, which Nisheeth mentioned, does a lot of taxonomizing of various ways that computer programs and internet-based platforms might, collect data and might use data, and gives people a lot of opportunity to give their consent or not give their consent. And I'm sure you've noticed you have to do a lot more, checking boxes now that GDPR is out there. But I think we might want to think further about, do we want to simply outlaw certain uses of behavioral data, certain uses of, web-based behavioral data that are collected simply as people go about their lives using the web? Or do we want to, say that only certain uses of these data or only certain data can be collected? All other data that are used for a specific purpose cannot be retained after they have fulfilled their purpose. Okay? I think we need to ask these questions And I think they're going to be very difficult to answer because in almost every case, any use of data or whether you characterize it as AI or not, any use of data that you say is harmful, might be beneficial in certain other contexts. That's the way I think about it.
Yeah, great. So I want to follow up. I mean, you're a world leading expert on encryption. So I wanted to follow up in particular on the relationship between these developments and encryption. Both what are the implications for vulnerability of encryption? That's one set of questions. It also strikes me in relation to the point you just made about, a lot of this is just about there's a lot more data out
Yes.
there.
And more computational power.
Right, and more computational power. And some of that data is data that has been obtained illegally through breaking encryption or through the failure to actually bother encrypting at all, right?
More often the latter.
Yeah, more often the latter. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the particular relationship between these kinds of issues and encryption in particular, and what you see as the special challenges in that in your field.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm not aware of AI artifacts breaking encryption. Okay, so again, I think that encryption algorithms and encryption systems, particularly ones that use key lengths that were perfectly appropriate 5 years ago, might be vulnerable now simply because there is a lot more computational power, and brute force breaking of encryption is always possible in principle. One chooses length of encryption keys with a mind towards thwarting, the feasibility of simply brute forcing, simply trying all the keys until you find one. It's not quite that simple. It's a little more sophisticated than that. But brute force meaning you don't actually mathematically break the encryption algorithm. You just chip away at it and throw a lot of computational power at it and throw a lot of parallelism at it and break it through brute force by finding the key. Okay, so could go on about that for hours, so I'll stop myself abruptly. I'm not aware of AI as such making the inversion, actually breaking the algorithm, actually coming up with a way to decrypt without finding the key, or making brute force search easier. But there are constantly tensions between law and computer science when it comes to encryption. Law enforcement has legitimate needs, authorized, warranted, authority to go and seize private information in certain situations. And if that information is encrypted, you can be out of luck. You can seize somebody's computer, but if you don't have the decryption keys for ciphertext that's located on that computer, it's not going to help you. So there's constantly a tension between law enforcement, certain people within law enforcement and within the government, within the Congress, who say we have to mandate some kind of access, some kind of, they call it exceptional access. I don't like that term. We have to mandate law enforcement access. If you're going to build an end-to-end encrypted communication system, if you're going to build any kind of system that uses strong encryption, you have to build into it some way that a law enforcement agent with a warrant can obtain the decryption keys. Okay, so the crypto community, the cryptographic research community, tends to abhor that attitude because basically it boils down to there is no way to build in access to decryption keys without introducing very serious vulnerabilities into the whole system. And law enforcement agents, you should know that right now, yes, it's true that strong end-to-end encryption thwarts your execution of warrants and thwarts your ability to catch criminals. But you know what else it thwarts? It thwarts crime. Okay, that our best defense against identity theft, against all kinds of theft or misuse or damaging of online assets is encrypting those assets. And in fact, I sat in this very room and gave, oh, actually, I think I was standing at the podium, gave a talk at a previous cyber forum in which I showed a bunch of anecdotes. This was shortly after the Snowden revelations. I showed a whole bunch of like horrible, appalling things that had happened. And then my conclusion is, well, all I can say is, why wasn't all of this data encrypted? Okay, if all of these people had been using strong encryption, all of these attacks would have failed. Okay, so there's an ongoing, probably never to be resolved, desire on the part of law enforcement for encryption not to thwart their efforts to catch criminals. Terrorists, for example, and child pornographers, and all kinds of people who could hide somewhat by using encryption. So what does this have to do with AI? Well, to the extent that cracks or exceptional access or ways to get around an encryption system that are mandated go into effect, everything that's obtained then becomes everything that's obtained either legitimately by a law enforcement agent that is given a key because he presents a warrant, or that is obtained because the cryptographic research community is right and vulnerabilities are introduced when you build in law enforcement access. Any kind of data that is thus obtained that would not have been obtained because it was encrypted can be fed into all of the machine learning algorithms that are out there, all of the databases that will allow people to generate deep fakes, all of the things that have access to a lot of data now will have all the more access to data, including super sensitive, super valuable data that is encrypted, that is properly encrypted, that is carefully encrypted by someone that's using a good key management system. So I think that's the AI feeds into this tension between law enforcement and encryption in the same way that AI feeds into everything that produces valuable data or makes valuable data available. It is now available to people who have state-of-the-art AI technology. So for better and for worse.
So last question from me, and I want to prime the audience both here in person and online. If you're online, put your questions in the Q&A box. And if you're in person, we'll take raised hands. Last quick question from me, Joan, which is about quantum computing. So Yale's at the forefront of quantum computing research, and sometimes that is referred to as kind of this coming revolution, particularly for encryption. People keep saying that, it keeps not happening. So like, how might quantum computing figure in here?
Well, in addition to being an AI skeptic, I am a quantum skeptic. I first heard about quantum computing and quantum cryptography in the mid-'80s. Okay, so it's the future, it's the technology of tomorrow, and it always will be. Now, again, skepticism is not rejection. Somebody comes to me tomorrow, replaces this MacBook Air with a quantum laptop that just runs like lightning and is just as capable and a whole lot faster, great. I'll use it, no problem. But I'm not holding my breath, okay? I think that there are tremendously interesting theoretical developments in quantum computing. And in particular, it's been known for a very long time. It's been known since the 90s that standard encryption algorithms, and in particular, standard public key encryption schemes, such as the Rivest-Shimon-Edelman scheme and the Diffie-Hellman key exchange scheme, and just things that rely on the computational intractability of several well-known problems, for those of you who know what this means: integer factoring and discrete logs. These are number theoretic computations that we do not know how to do fast on things like this. And that lack of knowledge, that intractability, has been turned into an advantage because it is the basis for the unbreakability of certain encryption schemes. That, by the way, is just an amazing thing. You know, it's the reason that I'm a computer scientist. I found out about that when I was a senior in college, where I was a math major, and I thought, oh my God, that is the cleverest thing I ever saw. And that's why I went to grad school in computer science. Again, I could talk about that all day, so got to stop myself very abruptly. So I think it's well known that quantum computers, those problems, integer factoring and discrete logs, are not intractable for quantum computers. Okay, so if we had actual, not just, you know, some kind of physics experiment that is touted, you know, in the media as a great breakthrough, but if we could actually take the lab level advances in actual quantum computers, as opposed to theoretical advances in quantum algorithms. So if we could actually take the physics advances and develop them into a real quantum computer, that would have enormous consequences for widely deployed crypto systems on which the security and privacy of everything now rests. Okay, again, I'm not holding my breath. So if that happened, that would be enormously important. You asked me to say, when do I think it's going to happen? I'm not sure it's ever going to happen. It's not going to happen next month. I guarantee you that. Okay. Nonetheless, I think the physics of quantum computing and the mathematics of quantum computing are interesting. I'm glad that Yale is active in this field. And if we ever do have a quantum laptop to replace this thing, I think that Yale's applied physics department will probably have made a big contribution to that, and that's wonderful. But it's a long way off. Okay, so the reason that, one of the reasons I'm somewhat skeptical about how much of a real world revolution quantum computing is going to be is not only that there hasn't, I think, been a whole lot of real progress towards actual quantum computers. There also, I mentioned before, quantum algorithms for factoring integers and for computing discrete logs. There's a small handful of other problems that are tractable in the quantum world, but not in the regular, von Neumann computer world, but only a small number. There's sort of a dearth of quantum algorithms. So that's another reason I'm a bit skeptical. Just as a former theoretical computer science, like pure theorist, I was always a little confused about why people were so fascinated by quantum computing. I had a brief moment of, oh, now I see it, when this factoring algorithms and discrete log algorithms were published. But again, that did not open the floodgates for a whole bunch of new, really interesting algorithms that would only work on a quantum computer, but not on this thing.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Ted to manage the Q&A. So
I have a quick comment, if it's okay. And I think it's important for me to say one thing in response to what Joan said. So I think this thing about there's nothing or not much intelligence about artificial intelligence. I think we have to dispel this myth, because if the dialogue has to go forward, it's not just about having a lot of data and a lot of computing. It is the selection of very, very sophisticated models with very interesting algorithms which can search the parameters of this model is why we are here. I mean, I think this myth about that AI and machine learning is just about a lot of data and a lot of computing has to be dispelled if you want to move forward. I mean, imagine trying to find a book in a Beinecke library. If you do not have a good framework to find it, you will not be able to find it, right? And the mechanisms that provide you how to search through this very complex web of books is the intelligence. And so the algorithms which are training these machine learning methods to find these very interesting parameters from the infinite space of parameters are very non-trivial. And this is the intelligence. That's why we are seeing so much. So I just wanted to kind of rebut this point.
You might want to hit your button.
I agree that there's intelligence in the design of frameworks and models and algorithms and the choice of parameters. But a lot of that, in the papers I read anyway, is human intelligence, not artificial intelligence. So anyway, I agree that there are things out there that I would call artificial intelligence. I just think there's also a lot of things that are called artificial intelligence that to me sound like statistics and algorithms.
Well, I think this raises a really important question is what do we mean by intelligence, right? I think that in the one sense, the divide between the two of you is that what Nisheeth is describing as the work of these algorithms is intelligence. And I think you're saying, well, it's just throwing a lot of data into a computational practice, and that's not intelligence. As
The design of algorithms is absolutely an exercise of intelligence, but that's been going on for a long time. And
That's
it's
right. So there's nothing new about
and
this.
it's intelligence, and it's intelligent humans who design those algorithms.
I wouldn't give the credit to the humans. I mean, intelligence is even there in nature outside of humans. And just the laws of physics are intelligent, actually. Right. I mean, there is a certain sense of efficiency because of which, life could have come here in just 4 billion years, right? Evolution is an intelligent algorithm. So in some sense. So I think, yeah, Joan, I take your point about intelligence, algorithms, which can, and I think I started off my speech by this in the beginning, that I view intelligence as an algorithm which can find something or solve a problem in an efficient way. Now, this efficient could be in terms of memory, it could be in terms of time, and the whole area of computer science is geared towards trying to understand this efficiency. And that's why, but I think many of the progresses that we are seeing in machine learning is not just data. I mean, if I give you 10 million cases from some court in New York and say, figure out something from it, it's not obvious how you figure out, right? So I think we have to understand that these deep fakes and stuff like that, which Joan talked about, just the pure fact that these can generate from pretty much scratch is an amazingly non-trivial fact, which we take for granted. And I think once we try to decondition ourselves from, okay, if we can do it, so it's not surprising that a computer or an algorithm can do it, we will start to understand the non-triviality in that. It's really non-trivial that we can generate images which look like humans, even if we have access to millions of images. I can't draw. Can anybody here draw an image which resembles a human? I mean, just think about it. It is intelligence in its raw form, in its sophisticated form. And I think the point is to understand this kind of intelligence, to regulate this kind of intelligence, we have to understand this kind of intelligence. So, and it's much more nuanced than, I think, just data and computation.
I certainly agree that is more involved than just data and computation. And I actually brought up deep fakes as something that I think is different from many of the advances in, say, machine learning and data mining. But I want to stress that your description of an algorithm that can, find the right parameter or can search in an intelligent way, or the description that you gave briefly there sounded to me like a description of algorithms and complexity. It sounded to me like a description of theoretical computer science, not of AI. So I'm not in any way denigrating the AI artifacts that are out there and the good results that they can bring to us. I'm just saying that in some cases, these great results and these artifacts are not using anything fundamentally different from what computer hardware and software has always used. So I'm hesitant to call it AI rather than simply computer hardware and software.
So I think
That's
this is a very productive conversation to have in our very first session of this conversation, because it raises the fact that there's some tension about the question of what is the thing we're talking about when we're talking about artificial intelligence. And I think, again, the space between you all is where we say computation crosses over the line into becoming intelligence. Right?
And you might
There's
say,
that.
who cares whether you call it AI or you
Right.
don't call it AI?
Right.
This whole thing might be much less controversial and have fewer of these kinds of arguments if we simply called it something else. But like whatever we call it, I think there is a lot of really amazing hardware and software out there now. There are just amazing art, AI artifacts, which would still be amazing if you didn't call them AI. Okay, there is a new computational environment that we're in that's fundamentally different from the environment we were in 10 years ago. And okay, if it's important to call that AI, I'm not gonna, refuse to participate simply because
I don't think it's I don't think it's a choice up to you or me. It's what the area is about,
well,
right? And I think we are having a discussion about AI and machine learning, so we have to be honest to the subject matter. Yeah.
So I'm just gonna call a halt here, just because I really do want to try and get the students in, but this is, I think, a very productive and important, and also great for students to see that, like, even among leading experts, there's some disagreement about what it is we're actually talking about here. So I think that's important. So over to Ted.
No, I mean, this is just a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Ona and Nisheeth. Joan really highlights the importance of bringing us together from different perspectives across the law, technology, policy, ethical approaches to AI-related challenges. So let's go to the audience. We'll go until 10:20. We'll collect a bunch of questions. I'm hopeful also that when we regroup in the next session, we'll carry over some of the conversation. So we'll keep this integrated. I have a bunch of ones here on Zoom too, but let's just go for folks here who are in person. Just raise your hand and I'll give you guys a chance to call. Yes, Natalie, and just briefly introduce yourself.
Okay, great. My name is Natalie. I'm a PhD student in political science, and my question is about data localization laws, and both from the sort of technical perspective in terms of how data localization laws are impacting research and development and the commercialization of new artificial intelligence software or hardware. And then also kind of on the political side of things in terms of their impact on national security and the sort of privacy and more human rights and civil liberties issues that we've been discussing.
So that one is for Ona, who's a great expert on this.
I put on my mask because I figured I was done talking, but
I guess the question, Ona, is also
me.
the translation of the data localization debate, the pre-AI debate, right, which was focused on sort of datas and the server debate. It's extension to sort of AI hardware and software.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole host of questions that I think that your question raises. So the data localization question is around what kinds of rules are there regarding, so in China, for instance, there's a requirement that data, that companies not port data outside of China, that it be held within, that it remain within China. There's sort of rules about collection of information about Chinese citizens. And it's actually very strong data privacy law in many ways, which is interesting because China is not necessarily regarded sometimes as like most privacy protecting environment. And part of what may be going on there is a concern about the possibilities of having significant amount of data about Chinese citizens being in the hands of multinational companies and being then fed into these algorithms where then there's significant vulnerability, potentially national security vulnerability around information about Chinese citizens and actors within the country. And the US so far has not adopted that. The EU has gone more the GDPR route, which is much more about, and we'll hear more about this in the next session. So this will be a kind of a good feed into the next section, which is much more about limitations on what kind of data can be collected rather than rules about where it has to be located and retained, which is the kind of more the data localization laws. I think that it's a really it's still a fast moving target. And the question about if you're concerned about privacy and you're concerned about national security issues, which in my case, I'm particularly, my area is national security. You are going to be concerned about the fact that there's massive amounts of data available in private hands that might have national security implications. And data localization laws do respond in part to that. But it does mean that you kind of have this fracturing potentially of data and availability of data. Not every country is prepared to put in place these data localization laws. It's a very fruitful area for research and writing. I think there's still not been anywhere near enough focus on these questions. I'm glad you're thinking about it.
I'm Kelly. I'm a undergrad in CS. And this is like kind of a really half-baked question. I'm really sorry. But like this kind of just arose from just hearing your back and forth. Obviously there's, as you mentioned, like there isn't often like intentional algorithmic bias being introduced into algorithms, but there is like kind of a need for people to start being held accountable for decreasing that algorithmic bias. Do you think like, or what would you think from the CS side or the technical side is the zone in which people are correctly being held accountable for introducing algorithmic bias or letting it stay in algorithms, and you know the zone between that and in which it would start significantly impacting like research and development?
Want to take that one, Nisheeth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess one of the things that we are in computer science, we didn't used to do so much. Maybe in the beginning of this subject we used to, but in some point we lost it, is focus on modeling. When we want to solve a high level nebulous problem, right? Let's say come up with an algorithm which decides who to give bank loans. We zoom past the modeling phase, which is what I was emphasizing in this back and forth with Joan, that, you know, how do we want to learn? What features of individuals shall we take into account when we are learning? What hypothesis class shall we use? What algorithm shall we use to learn these parameters? So there's this whole space which is huge in between, and the traditional approach in computer science has to be just zoom past it, do the obvious thing, and then spend a lot of time trying to focus on the algorithms and complexity of these algorithms, developing these algorithms, which will learn something. But now what is happening is that people are realizing that and opening up this space in between data and the algorithm, the training algorithm, and questioning each and every aspect of the design process. You know, for example, if I'm choosing Ona's data, using Ona's data, what data shall I use? What features are relevant? In the end, you know, the features are only a partial description of her, right? So what features shall I use? What features might be correlated with her protected features, and so on and so forth. All these discussions are happening and are feeding into the model choices. How do we learn about people so that it doesn't bring in the bad aspects or the biased aspects, and yet brings in the utility? That there's a reason why we are learning from data. It's because it makes the process more efficient. So I think this is the space in which CS is moving, and there are, I think this is where I suggest to look. There are big conferences now held in this. There's a lot of literature, and there's a huge amount of discussion between social sciences, law, and computer science into this process, which is neither software nor hardware. This is the process of being the architect of the algorithm. You know, how to design this algorithm or these algorithms.
Nisheeth, just as a follow-up, we have a virtual question here from one of your Yale Computer Science Department colleagues who says, you know, rather than demand an AI program have no bias, can we determine if the AI bias is less than the human bias in the task domain? So for example, a driverless car still may cause an accident, but it may be very well much fewer accidents than the human drivers. So the question is sort of, how do you develop better metrics for understanding if you're improving the bias against like a human control as opposed to.
Yeah, excellent question. It's not in my domain to answer this question, but let me tell you the complexity of this question. Anytime humans choose to measure something, it's a value judgment. If I choose to say, that SAT score or whatever, right, it is associating a value judgment. If I want to understand if a student will do well at Yale or not, and I start looking at proxies like SAT score, grades, this and that, we are imposing a huge amount of value judgment into this process by choosing metrics. And so far, this process of developing algorithms which are trying to mimic human intelligence has been largely in the domain of computer scientists. And so who are not well trained in this idea of how we are imparting our judgments when we're choosing metrics. And I think this is where these kinds of forums are extremely important, to bring in people from multiple disciplines and be more aware of, if I choose a particular metric to judge an algorithm, what value is it reflecting? So I cannot answer this question, but I can just say that I have only recently understood the depth and significance of this question. It's very easy to say an algorithm A is better than algorithm B, or a person A is better than person B, but it's going into this philosophical policy debate about what does it even mean and why are we choosing that. Is the real way forward. And I think that the exciting thing is that this is all very contemporary, this is all happening, and there is a lot of scope for especially young people to get into this domain.
So I think, unfortunately, we are going to have to stop our time. We have a lot of questions here, and I'm sure there are more in the audience. So we're going to definitely incorporate all those as we go. And this is just a great way to kick off the conversation. So please join me in thanking Professor Hathaway, Professor Vishnoi, and Professor Feigenbaum. So let's take a break. We have a few minutes here. You can grab a beverage, stretch, and we're going to reconvene promptly with our next session at 10:30. Really looking forward to continuing the conversation on AI governance and regulation and equity. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nisheeth.
Oh, thank you, Ted.
We really look forward to seeing you.